barbed wire. Raiders moved on their bellies, crawling forward inch by inch through the darkness. The great thing, as one soldier put it, was patience. If you went slow enough and kept on your belly, you couldn't be heard or seen. The wire was a major obstacle. Barbed wire was sometimes 30 feet wide and 5 or 6 feet tall, with multiple rows of iron stakes and strand upon strand of barbed wire. Some had empty tins hung on them that would rattle and give warning if anyone touched it. Wire-cutting parties would sometimes go out nights before the raid to cut paths, so the raiding party would spend less time in the open. At any moment during the crossing, raiders faced the terrifying possibility of illumination. Both sides used star shells, which were artillery rounds that burst at a certain height and lit up a magnesium flare hanging from a small parachute. When one went up, it blazed brightly for a minute or more, lighting up no man's land like midday sun. The Germans also used pistol flares that gave light for 10 or 15 seconds. The instant raiders saw a flare going up, they would freeze, not daring to move until the light died. Any movement caught in the glare would bring down machine gun fire immediately. One veteran explained that you had to keep your head down and your eyes closed because if you watched the light, your eyes would reflect it, and the enemy sentries looking into the darkness would spot you more easily. Then the next thing to take care of were the sentries. Both sides kept listening posts out in no man's land, in front of the main trench line, specifically to detect enemy parties. If they spotted anything suspicious, they would immediately raise the alarm, and the whole front would start firing into no man's land. So, raiders had to find these listening posts and either avoid or silence them. Standard practice was to creep slowly up on the sentries and then kill them as quietly as possible in the silence of the night. Enemy patrols were another danger. Both sides sent men out into no man's land at night, so there was always a chance that a raiding party would run into an enemy patrol doing the same thing. These encounters could turn into desperate hand-to-hand battles in the shell holes and craters of no man's land. Raiders and patrols also learned that when the enemy wasn't firing any shots and wasn't sending up any flares, it meant that they also had a patrol out somewhere nearby. When two patrols of opposing sides accidentally met in no man's land, they sometimes let each other pass without fighting, because they both knew that if someone started shooting, the whole front section would open up and nobody was coming back to their line. So, sometimes they just let each other go their separate ways. Once the raiders actually reached the enemy trench and dropped inside, the brutal and up-close fighting began immediately. Every second spent in the enemy trench was another second for enemy soldiers in neighboring sections to grab their weapons and come running, so they had to make it count. They used the chaos and confusion, killed as many soldiers as they could, threw grenades into dugouts, destroyed equipment, and if possible, captured prisoners. Then the return journey was usually the most dangerous part of all. The raiders were now moving quickly, possibly dragging unwilling prisoners or wounded comrades through no man's land back to their lines. Machine guns and artillery could sweep across no man's land at any moment. In all that chaos and darkness, many raiders got disoriented, lost their sense of direction, and jumped into a trench with a sense of relief, only to realize they had made a terrible mistake. They came back to the enemy trench, where the soldiers inside weren't quite happy to see them. Friendly fire was another concern on the return, even if nothing else had killed you somehow. The sentries in your own trench knew a raiding party was out, but in the confusion of darkness and incoming fire, it was easy for an understandably nervous man to shoot at shapes coming over the parapet. Password systems were set up so returning raiders could identify themselves when challenged, hopefully. But then sometimes the sentry was relieved and the new one didn't get the information about the raiding party that might be coming back in a few hours. And all of this effort, all of this risk was for objectives that often seemed trivial to the men who were dying doing them. The officers 30 miles behind the lines wanted to know what was going on the opposite side, so they simply ordered someone to go and take a look. Many trench raiding operations were never mentioned outside of command because the men simply went out and none of them ever returned. And even if the raid was successful without many casualties, it would likely only bring retaliation the following night. Armies gradually developed purpose-built weapons for trench fighting. The pistol, which had previously been just a secondary weapon or something officers carried, became essential for raiding parties. The British Webley revolver worked well in mud, but it only held 6 rounds. The Colt M1911 was highly prized by the Americans, while the Germans had their Luger. The MP-18 was the real breakthrough for trench fighting. Chambered in 9mm firing at about 400 rounds per minute from a 32-round drum magazine, it gave German stormtroopers devastating firepower in the tight spaces of trenches. Only about 3,000 actually saw frontline combat, but the MP-18 proved the concept worked, and it set the pattern for most submachine guns that came after it. The American contribution to trench weapons was the infamous Winchester Model 1897 trench shotgun. The most interesting thing you've surely heard about this gun was what they called slam fire. Unlike modern pump-action shotguns, the M1897 didn't have a trigger disconnector, which meant it fired every time the action closed, as long as the trigger was held down. A trained soldier could fire all 6 shells in about 2 seconds, making it impossible not to hit a large number of enemy soldiers. It worked so well that the German government formally protested against the use of shotguns, threatening to execute soldiers captured with them or even shotgun shells, arguing that they caused unnecessary suffering. The Germans were then reminded of their flamethrowers and poisonous gases as examples of weapons that actually caused unnecessary suffering, and were told that if they retaliated against soldiers captured with shotguns, the response would be much worse. The close-quarters killing in the trenches also forced armies to develop proper hand-to-hand combat training, and programs in jiu-jitsu, boxing, and wrestling were implemented on all sides. As the war ground on, both sides began to realize that small-scale raiding, while useful, would never win the war by itself. What was needed was a way to apply those same principles of speed, surprise, and close-quarters violence on a much larger scale. And that is exactly what the Germans set out to create. They created the first official stormtrooper unit with an idea that would change trench warfare and show the first reliable way to break the deadlock. Instead of attacking the whole width of the front, like every failed offensive before, stormtroopers would attack key points only. They would completely bypass strong points, leaving those for the follow-up waves to deal with and seep into the enemy's rear to overrun artillery batteries and command posts. The idea was to cut frontline troops off from their headquarters and supply depots, and the whole system would collapse from within. Now, this was a completely different approach from the trench raiders we talked about earlier. Raiders would slip in, gather intelligence, and slip back out. Stormtroopers had a different objective. They would create breaches that regular infantry could then pour through and exploit. This required a complete change in how commanders thought about battle. Junior officers were encouraged to lead through their own personal judgment rather than waiting for orders from above, because independence, quick thinking, and resourcefulness were needed in real time in order to succeed. Stormtroopers were elite soldiers, recruited from volunteers, mostly men under 25 with athletic backgrounds. They carried satchels full of grenades, and when the MP-18 submachine gun became available, stormtroopers got priority for them. They also used Luger pistols with an extended 32-round drum magazine and a shoulder stock. They even had flamethrowers and a lighter version of the MG-08 machine gun that could be brought forward during an attack. And of course, trench clubs, knives, maces, and other tools for the inevitable hand-to-hand fighting in the end. Italy developed its own elite assault forces around the same time called the Arditi, which means the daring ones. But unlike the Germans, who spread assault tactics throughout the whole army, the Italians kept their elite units separate. Some Arditi units became infamous for choosing to fight with nothing but grenades and their signature daggers. They did achieve real successes, and they terrified enemy troops who faced them, but at tremendous cost. They had an extremely high casualty rate, unsurprisingly, and many raids ended simply with nobody from the party ever returning. They were strictly volunteers, chosen from the bravest and fittest soldiers available. But it was the German stormtroopers who proved just how devastating these new tactics could be when applied on a large scale. At the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, German stormtrooper units led an attack that captured 265,000 Italian prisoners and advanced over 60 miles toward Venice. Erwin Rommel, who would become one of the most famous German generals of the next war, was a 26-year-old stormtrooper commander at the time. With just 150 men, he captured 1,500 Italian prisoners in a single action by finding hidden paths through Italian positions and attacking from behind where nobody expected him. Caporetto showed what stormtroopers could do, but Germany's real target was always the Western Front, and soon they would get their chance. When Germany ended the war with Russia in March 1918, nearly 50 divisions were transferred west. For the first time since 1914, Germany actually outnumbered the Allies on the Western Front. This was their chance to win the war before American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers. The spring offensive began with over 1 million shells fired in just 5 hours. The biggest artillery barrage of the entire war. Fog, on the morning of March 21st, allowed stormtroopers to slip deep into British positions without being seen. They achieved the deepest advances on the Western Front since 1914, pushing forward 40 miles in 2 weeks. For the first time in years, warfare became mobile again, and it even looked like Germany might actually have a chance to win the war. But the problem was that the Germans had not expected such success, and they weren't adequately prepared to take advantage of it. Stormtroopers quickly moved faster than their own artillery could follow, and supply lines collapsed over the cratered wasteland the artillery had created. The best men had been pulled out of regular units and concentrated into storm units, and these elite soldiers suffered disproportionately heavy casualties that simply couldn't be replaced. The offensive eventually stalled, and this failure was part of why Germany ultimately lost the war. What followed was an Allied counterattack with over 400 tanks and the biggest combined force attack until then. By autumn, over 100,000 German prisoners had been taken, and the armistice came on November 11, 1918. Europe in 1914 was considered the pinnacle of modern civilization, the most technologically advanced society the world had ever seen. And yet this modern war spiraled into the most primal and savage form of combat known to man. Despite artillery, machine guns, aeroplanes, submarines, warships, and tanks, it all eventually ended with clubs and sharpened shovels.